Alright, what's up everyone? Today I'm going to try to cover a natural rights foundation of ethics and its applications to libertarianism and political science in general. Obviously this will not suffice as a giant exposition or anything of that matter. It will just suffice as a general explanation and an introduction to libertarian ethics and political science. And clearly as follows, any systems that I attempt to refute within this said video too will not suffice as a general exposition, rather a very introductory premise of the critiques that I offer. I just simply hope that I'm providing a sufficient bridge between these foundations of ethics, the critiques that I offer, and sufficiently justifying my said system and demonstrating the causal relations between the two. When we begin our analysis of our foundation of ethics, we have to look at what man's nature is. And what this consideration becomes is evidently noted by Rothbard. Man does not simply exist in a vacuum, isolated on his own, with no relation to any other men. Men exist within social contexts. They exist relative to one another in peaceful cooperation. That is the nature of man. The nature of man is not to say that they exist on an isolated island, say each being in a Robinson Crusoe area. The nature of man is to say that we interact with one another, we develop off one another, we learn off one another, we cooperate, we exchange. That this is the nature of man within any pretext of analysable givens. Not only does other entities exist, innumerable entities exist, each entity having a vast range and distinct properties, which can all be investigated and analysed by man's reason. The activity of all these entities, whether organic or inorganic, is a consequence of, first, its own nature as entities, and the subsequent consequences of the environment around that man himself. As distinctly noted in the very basic axiom that man acts, all men are necessarily preconditioned to act. In order to act, man must necessarily choose his own desired ends and employ the appropriate means that he analyses with his reason to achieve these ends. In order to sufficiently analyse these ends and understand himself in adaptation to his environment, man must necessarily have free association. He has to be free to learn, to develop his faculties of reason, to act upon these values that he's preconditioned by the nature of action. To interfere with these peaceful state of affairs is to vehemently go against man's nature, as he's necessarily a free associating being, that he has to be free in order to develop his own ends and understand himself and his environment and utilise these ends to act. So if man is necessarily coerced against or aggressed against, we may say that the man himself who aggresses is anti-human. And if he's anti-human as a man, he must necessarily be in contradiction, always. As how can one necessarily claim to be a man and yet go against his own nature? Only those extremely high time preference individuals that need not be treated as actual men would go against their own nature. So if we can say that men who refuse to utilise their reason and be preconditioned by their own nature as men are those extremely high time preference individuals, why should we treat them as men? Why should we interact with them? Why should we engage with men who want to distort our peaceful cooperation? These men are mere beasts. They're no men at all, because their defining characteristic of utilising reason is no longer present. They're no longer utilising reason. They're acting irrationally in that idiocentric sense. They're going against their own nature to aggress against their fellow men. They're incapable of respecting their fellow men's rights. So why should we respect theirs? Why should we treat them as men? Why shouldn't they be treated as subhuman? Why shouldn't they be treated as animals? Those aggressors have no justification in being men at all. They're necessarily beasts, free-roaming, and they need not be treated like men. Obviously, this sort of view is conditioned by its individualistic analysis, and the individualist has often been charged with a sort of vacuum analysis, unable to account for those social influences over the individual himself, or his externalized environment. And thus some people claim that the individualist, by abstracting the part from its whole, necessarily distorts key information that would presently be considered within the collective analysis. This presupposes a sort of determinism. But in my own view, this claim is mischarged and misses the point. No good individualist would forget to include societal influences in analysis. It's very evident that man, as a social being, must necessarily take into account those social influences. As if we don't charge a vacuum analysis. We take into account that man must necessarily free associate, must exchange, must be free to develop his own faculties. He must be free to peacefully cooperate with other men. This is an integral variable, not only to his own survival, but his further prosperity as an entity. However, what this charge fails at is to note that even with societal influences, At the end of the day, the individual still has ultimate control over his own being. If he is convinced by the mere rhetoric or pressure that is put on him by society, he will simply adapt this into his value scale. But this is not determined. There's nothing to say that this is determined. It's up to the individual whether he decides to adopt, to affirm, to negate, to reject, or any other being of these societal influences. Thereby, we can say that the starting point of these natural rights is to analyse man's nature, is an analysis of the individual, and thereby the nature of ownership, or the concept of self-ownership. What this right asserts is an absolute and ultimate control over one's self by virtue of his own nature, meaning this individual must always be free from the forces of evil, coercion, and violence. As previously said, man is preconditioned to act by his own nature. To survive and to prosper, he must necessarily be free from those coercive forces preventing him from being free to learn, develop his faculties of reason, and freely choose his own ends and employ means to achieve them. To coerce against men in these conditions, to prevent him from developing these said means and ends, or to prevent him from utilising his reason, is to go against man's own nature. In order to embody these rights within a general concept, we draw to self-ownership. If this concept as such is to be denied, there exists only two possible alternatives. One of the two is to say that a certain group of people, or class A in this case, have a right to own another class. That is to say that they are in a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority. Something along the lines of one group may be human, and the other group may be subhuman. The second case scenario is that everyone within the society has an equal right to own and have a say over everyone else. Every man, by virtue of using himself, must necessarily first obtain consent by those owners. Let's say we have a man called Bob. If Bob doesn't attain the consent of every other owner, or in this case the totality of society, then he may not necessarily consume apples. He may be preconditioned to starve and die because the other owners haven't consented to his consumption of utilising his own body. We may critique both points. The first option is necessarily to say that one class is subhuman and thereby has a pretext of inferiority, but under any consideration that class B, or the subhuman class, is indeed human itself falls into direct contradiction. How can we necessarily affirm the precondition that one class is subhuman when they attempt to freely associate, when they utilise their reason in order to attain ends, to deploy means? They attempt to exchange. How can we say that these people are subhuman? And what gives the other class any pretext over them? This just seems like arbitrary stipulations and judgments that based on emotions. How can we necessarily say logically or truth claimed without immediately falling into a system of polygalism that one class is inferior? Because this simply isn't true. All men are equal at their very fundamental pretext. All men are self-owners. All men necessarily have the right not to be aggressed against. All men have the right to freely associate. All men have the right to adapt their own ends. This is necessarily to say that all men have equal rights. No class is inferior to another. Everyone is equal at that very fundamental level. Not only this, but to say that Class A owns Class B is to distinctly violate the basic economic requirements preconditioned for man's survival and prosperity, of production and exchange. The second proposition of the previously stated argument can again be said to fall under multiple considerations. First, the communalism idea rests upon the fallacious argument that every man is entitled to own a select part of everyone else, and yet not entitled to ownership over himself. This logic is entirely fallacious and subsidizes different categorizations of truth over different people, and thereby engages in polygalism or outright special pleading. What is to say that if every man has a claim over everyone else, why shouldn't he have a claim over himself? What is to say this? There's no truth claim which says as such. This is a purely arbitrary judgment which can't be justified. Only by engaging in polygalism, or just generally being fallacious, can any man avoid this, which again is very logically inconsistent. Secondly though, this argument also clearly falls on the condition that if this were really true, communally everyone would have a say in regards to everyone else, then man's survival would quickly fall. This is to say that the vast majority of men would very quickly perish. The more this communalism idea of ownership over one's own self is perpetrated, the more people that will die as a subsequent consequence. How is man to gain the consent of the totality or all of society or all other owners of himself without first starving or dying of dehydration? But even so, disregarding all these previous arguments, the way that action is preconditioned would quickly reflect this to be an impossibility. If every man must get distinct permission from everyone else before acting in any manner, this clearly falls into regress. This is to say that if every man is owned by everyone else, surely the person giving the other man permission for action must have also been given permission by someone else, who must have also been given permission by someone else, and so on into infinity. We may also say that if every man was really owned by every other man, then he must necessarily have permission before he commits any action, but abstaining from action itself is just as much as an action. Man is necessarily always in a state of action, apart from those very slight instances where he's in a state of reflex. But obviously, man can never always be in reflex. This doesn't work. He must necessarily almost always be acting, and thus, to gain consent before abstaining from action, or gaining the consent of others before acting at all, is an untenable impossibility. We may also note that in order to gain the consent, any man must necessarily act. How am I to gain the consent of any other man without first asking for his consent, indicating in some way his consent, or even abstaining from acting to gain his consent? If I do nothing, I am still acting. There's no way that I can possibly gain any other man's consent without first acting. Thus, this theory of ownership becomes entirely untenable. It's impossible to sustain. And if it is such that man would quickly perish under this theory of ownership, it again falls into contradiction with man's own nature, as man is preconditioned to his own survival. It becomes antithetical to man's own nature himself, which puts any man in a state of contradiction. Or we may say he is acting without reason and thus not take his considerations seriously, as he is not acting in a rational manner. Secondly, it is important to note also the physical impossibility that the existent entities can keep sufficient tabs and exercise their partial ownership over all other entities. How is to man always give consent to every other man in order to enable them to act? How is this possible? How can all men necessarily do this at all times? The simple answer is it isn't, and this theory just falls into entirely untenable grounds. However, from this we need also deduce a natural principle of property for those objects that do not reside as the property of a body or the self. And this is generally a little more difficult and ambiguous to construct. An example that Rothbard offers: if we say that X directly assaults B, he is distinctly acting with an aggressive format. However, if the same X were to take B's watch, would it be as easy to claim the same format of aggression? Well, not necessarily. X could claim to be the true owner / appropriator of B's watch. Thus, a distinctive and systematic property theory must be developed within libertarianism. However, before we begin any construction, I'd like to begin with a critique of a certain libertarian views on property. Some libertarians take the position that assigning those certain property rights should be left to the government decree. But as one can intuitively sense, this from the outset seems fallacious. For a group who claim to supposedly be skeptical of government to then claim that we can trust government to decree property titles in a society in a fair and unjust manner is absolutely absurd, and by its very nature a special pleading fallacy. As if we can't trust the government to interfere with businesses in a just and fair manner anywhere else, then why should we do this with property titles when they have an absolute claim to it? If we give the government absolute power to decree property titles, what makes this fair? What makes the government here trusted, but not in other areas? For such a group who views government as evil and an aggressor, to then give it ultimate power over that very thing that makes aggression as horrid as it is, it will surely lead to disastrous consequences. For example, if the government decided that enough was enough for its reign and unilaterally assigned property titles to those cronies who bid the highest for titles, the utilitarian libertarians, if he was consistent with his own theory, must thereby have no issue accepting this new government decree as the new social order. This clearly gives away for feudalism, as then those cronies can then go on to collect rent, or essentially make the subjects or homesteaders his serfs. However, those natural rights theorists such as myself, our theory of rights and justice allow those proponents to say that these newly unilaterally assigned property titles are completely invalid, as these property titles, 1, are consistent with the homesteading principle, and 2, are completely arbitrarily decided by government, who didn't even acquire these properties validly. Government has acquired its property through territorial conquest and aggression. This is not a valid construct of property. Those natural rights libertarians can then scoff at these titles and say, we're not accepting this as a social order because these were unjustly acquired and they're completely arbitrary assignments. Why should I have to pay rent to this cronyist who bid for the highest title if this wasn't a homesteaded principle? Why should I have to engage with this? I shouldn't, because these titles are completely invalid. And thus this allows us to have a consistent theory of rights which applies with our theories of rights and justice. When developing an externalized theory of property, we may note that man himself is not a self-sustainable entity. He requires natural resources to sustain his lifestyle and his life form. It is a precondition for man's very survival that he adapt and conform to the natural environment around him and take usage of the natural resources to develop closer to his goals or his particular chosen ends that he wishes to acquire through means. Thus, he must apply his labour to the natural environment, engaging in a productive process that takes time to complete, transforming those relatively higher order goods into consumer goods ready for consumption. It's of necessity that these capital goods are necessarily employed to achieve means to desired ends, as a necessary precondition for man's own survival. The question then arises, who gets to use what capital goods, and how can they be assigned? I.e. the question of property titles. If we take the example of any productive process, let's say someone producing a fishing rod to catch fish for his own consumption, how do we distinctly say that the materials used put in this fishing rod are distinctly the producer's? Natural rights proponents such as myself would say that the materials are in fact the producer's creation, in the sense that he has expended his own energy to accumulate those natural unowned resources and take them out of the commons, transforming them by his ideas that he has picked up and put into agency by the usage of his own body. He has essentially extended himself onto this object. If by man's own nature, man has the right to own his own body, then surely by a precondition to his own survival he must also have the right to own those objects he expends his own being in. This is to say that he makes it an expression of himself. He has in essence embodied himself within the said object, and by the usage of his prior own characteristics he thereby claims ownership of this object. Thereby we have three available options. We may say that the creator of such an object comes to own it by the virtue of his own essence. Or alternatively, we may say that one man or a group of men may have justification and the title ownership over a certain creation after a sequence of coercive appropriation of another homesteaded resource. Or in other words, slavery. And then obviously there is still the case of communal ownership. It should be asked for those proponents of aggression and theft, what necessarily gives that man the right to take something that is a formation of any other man, something that has been distinctly shaped within its own properties to embody those preferences and the properties of its sculptor, embodying in it with a distinct connection to himself, or we may necessarily say an extension of oneself to those material possessions? One may claim by such arbitrary, ridiculous dogmatism as, by allowing for this coercive violation of property rights or aggression against certain homesteaders, produces the highest amount of utility for the totality of those members of society, and thereby produces the most positive consequences for the vast amount of society. However, we may say that this view is the optimum of ethical incoherence. Each man who comes into contact with such arbitrary dogmatism must ask himself one fundamental question about this pretext. If these events, such as the specified relation discussed earlier, can be shown through those property rights over oneself, then why is producing the highest utility for society even relevant to any extent? If such an event can be shown with inference to its own substance to be a cognitively unjustifiable position, then why should we take such arbitrary stipulations, such as a utility argument, to mean anything but emotional whims? There is no distinct deductive chain of reasoning that we should infer to a higher utility from. This is a pure claim made from emotion. What is to say we shouldn't strive for lower utility? What is the substance behind these claims to begin with? A second point that may be raised against this so-called utilitarian argument is one of pointing out the distinct impossibility of one entity to possess the totality or even a sufficient fraction of the totality of local knowledge to thereby determine what would produce the highest utility on the general prescription of each subject. Further, we may also say in the absence of a formulated price mechanism, utilitarianism becomes an impossibility to formulate any pragmatic application, and thereby will consistently lead to any society with the absence of private property and the factors of production to misjudge any calculation of utility and continually take part in cognitively unjustifiable acts. As first noted, one entity can never possess the totality of local knowledge within any society pertaining to numerous amounts of existing entities. Within these societies, the innumerable amount of actions that occur within a relatively small time frame, under this basis we can say that the amount of local or private knowledge created even in a matter of seconds will consistently outpace more than any actor physically can comprehend, or that actors have the physical capacity to do so, spatially speaking. No actor can be present for every action that can possibly occur, as this would require he be in numerous positions at once, and be able to comprehend all the information around him. I do not think this requires much elaboration on why this cannot occur. I trust the viewer can intuitively sense that this is an impossibility. The main point to emphasize here, however, is that as no planner, or entity for that matter, can possess all of this local knowledge, this includes the totality of that interpersonal utility, so long as we take that no entity can thereby possess all such knowledge upon each actor's ends, we can thereby also say that the course of action embarked on can never be said with certainty to produce the highest utility for those general members of society. If one retains the position that all these ends are necessarily arbitrary and thereby ends within themselves cannot be that of a cognitive problem and possesses nothing within their substance that makes them preferable, based on this lack of informational availability, one can never say that X course of action is more preferable than Y course of action based on the utility generally gained by its existence. This will very quickly be seen to reduce not into a general utility gained, but the utility gained by one actor alone taking that course of action, possibly harming the general utility that could have been gained upon any other course of action.